Now let's review the process for modifying, voiding, and also performing co-signature when working with preceptors and students. We'll begin the process with modification of entries. From the patient care management profile, simply select a flow sheet that you want to modify entry for. For example, we'll click on the ADL flow sheet and note that in the past someone had voided or modified data. Voided data is indicated by X's next to the data and lines through the words. Modification of data will be indicated by a yellow folder next to the new data entry. As described, we'll first perform modification. We'll locate data that we intend to modify or change. That data would be in a hyperlink format or blue and underlined. We'll select the observation by clicking on it. At the bottom of the screen, we'll note that there are two tabs for choices to modify or void that data. We'll select the Modify tab and then perform the data entry that would be appropriate for the patient, as well as add comments to describe our modification. We'll then save the information by clicking the Saved button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll receive a pop-up verifying that this is our choice. Once we've saved the data, we are returned to a screen to further review confirmation of our modification. We can then return back to patient care management, return to our ADL flow sheet, and observe the modification. By scrolling down on our ADL flow sheet, we'll observe now the yellow folder next to the data that we modified. To perform a voiding of data, again, we can select the entry that we've entered, so we'll click on the hyperlink. We'll then scroll to the bottom of the page and choose Void. Select OK to verify your choice to void. And scrolling down, you'll notice that there is a pink X with a line through the data that we chose to void. You are only able to modify or void your own data entries. Also note that modification allows you to enter comments into the comments field, whereas voiding data does not. This is because the only reason you should be voiding data is if the data is in fact erroneous for that patient. Therefore, no comments are required. You also have the ability to void an entire assessment rather than a singular entry. Simply go to Patient Care Management Profile, select the flow sheet with the assessment that you choose to void. In this circumstance, we'll click on the Admission Data and History flow sheet. At the top of the flow sheet, you'll see a tab for Void. Select the Void tab, and a field will open allowing you to select the date and time for the entry of the entire assessment. There may be multiple dates and times here, so be sure that you select the correct one. Simply click the button and select Void Assessment. Again, a pop-up will appear validating that you want to void that entire assessment. You'll now be returned back to the flow sheet where you can view that your entire assessment has been voided. You may also void assessments from the All Assessments tab of the Navigator. Simply click on the All Assessments tab, find the assessment that you choose to void, move to the right and select the Void tab. Any assessments available for voiding would be listed below. You would follow the same process by selecting the Date and Time button next to the assessment you choose to void and selecting the Void Assessment tab. Finally, let's review the process for providing co-signatures for preceptor and student documentation. Anytime a clinical student enters information into the electronic medical record, the preceptor must validate that that entry is accurate and correct for the patient. Simply have the student document their assessment or data on the specified flow sheet. For example, we'll use the ADL flow sheet to the right. As the student, I will now chart new information under my username and login. For demonstration, I'll use default values and now, and I'll leave the fields as they are showing below. Note at the bottom of the screen there is a tab for preceptor cosign. Keeping this blank, I'm going to chart and exit as the student under the student login. Once the documentation is complete and the student has logged out, the preceptor now should log in under their username and password, assuming I am now the preceptor, and ignore the instruct2 username. We'll assume that this is actually the student's entry. As the instructor, I have now logged in, and I'm going to validate that this entry was made by my student was all correct or requires modifications. I'll simply go to Chart New, and below the assessment, I'll select Reviewed and Accurate or Reviewed and Revised. If the assessment is accurate, nothing further is required to be entered. If the assessment requires revision, I will enter the appropriate documentation in the fields. I'll chart Reviewed and Accurate now and exit. Requesting the current time, date, and stamp. Now scrolling down, we can view that the instructor reviewed the documentation up to this point, noting the time and date, and that it is accurate. If at any time there was modification to be performed, the instructor or preceptor has access to modify any entry performed by a clinical student. For example, we'll assume that the patient's repositioning should have been entered. We'll go to the entry for bed mobility and select the self entry. Again, we can modify this entry as the preceptor by selecting Modify and put the correct information in the box. In the comments, clinical student entry modified and verified by preceptor. I can then click Save. I get confirmation, returning back to my patient care profile, and back to the ADL flow sheet. I'm now able to identify that this entry was modified by clicking on the yellow box. I can see that it was the actual instructor's username and login at the time that this modification was performed, separately from the student's data entry. This concludes the process for modification, voiding, and co-signing documentation.